Hello again, it's Alister McGrath at Oxford University, and this is the second in a series of presentations exploring how we make sense of our world and the meaning of our place within it. And I've been interested in this relationship of atheism, science and Christianity for a long time. I'm going to reflect on this relationship in these presentations, which I've kept very simple and very informal. They're much more like conversations than lectures. So let me begin by talking a bit about this whole idea of an island of faith. Why have I found that analogy to be so helpful? Well, I find the analogy of an island of faith to be really useful as a visual image to describe my own journey of discovery and exploration over many years. And it helps me describe how I was intellectually shipwrecked, actually, when my early belief in the certainty of atheism simply fell apart. And I ended up on the shoreline of a strange new world of faith that I decided to explore. So for me, these images of discovery and exploration are really very important. And I've always enjoyed reading books like, Homer's Odyssey, which describe people making journeys, very often life-changing journeys, and discovering more about themselves as they travel. One of the books that captured my imagination as a boy was R.M. Ballantyne's 1858 novel, The Coral Island. And this tells about 3 British teenage boys who were shipwrecked on an uninhabited South Pacific island. And it was a very well written book, and I loved its evocative descriptions of the island's exotic landscape. Phrases like its starry sky, its gently rustling trees, and the sound of the distant roaring of the surf upon the coral reef. All of that was simply entrancing. But what I think I found to be the most enthralling aspect of this tale was the way in which the 3 teenagers, in exploring this new world, actually began to grow as people. And this made me want to travel to the Southeast to experience these vistas for myself and to become a wiser person as a result. And I have to say I never did, by the way. But there's another kind of voyage of discovery that we can make. And this kind of journey of discovery is not so much about traveling physically to some distant landscape, but rather experiencing a transformation of our minds, which means that we see things we already know, in a new way. One of his novels, the French novelist Marcel Proust, suggests that the true voyage of discovery is not about, traveling throughout the world to find new landscapes, but rather looking at the ones that we already know and seeing them in new ways. For example, by looking at them through somebody else's eyes, so that we can see something that we might have missed or never dreamt actually was there in the first place. Now, this kind of discovery really is about journeying in the sense that we see things we already know, but in a completely different way. We see things in a new light, realizing their true importance and value for the first time. And Proust invites us to see the world through the eyes of other people. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about people in the past or people in the present. The important thing is that they have seen something that we have missed. These people help us to notice things that we might not otherwise see, and it means that we see things in a new way. For example, we might look at what seems to be a meaningless world, and we see it in a new way. It suddenly makes sense, and we begin to realize we missed its true significance. The landscape, in one sense, is the same as before, but yet we see it in a new light and appreciate it in a new way. Now, in this presentation, I want to tell you about 2 distinct yet related journeys of discovery I've made over my lifetime. And these 2 journeys are actually interconnected with each other. One of them is my journey from atheism to Christianity, and I want to explain how this happened and the various factors that made me begin to have serious doubts about the credibility of my teenage atheism. So that's one journey. But there was another journey going on at the same time. And that was the discovery that the absolute certainty that I craved in all of my beliefs was simply an illusion. So let me tell you about how I became a scientific atheist and where I went from there. It all began, I suppose, when I developed a love for science. And this happened back in the early 1960s when I'd always enjoyed the beauty of nature, the richness of landscapes, but I began to look at them with new interest. And a great uncle, who was a pathologist at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast, who'd retired many years ago from the medical profession, he heard about my growing interest in the natural world. And so he gave me his old microscope so that I could really begin to look at nature in greater depth. Now, back then I saw nature as something that was wonderful in itself, but which seemed also to point to something mysterious that lay behind it or perhaps beyond it. Now, my uncle had actually bought this microscope for himself when he was a medical student in Belfast in the first decade of the 20th century, and he thought I might like to have it so that I could explore the natural world in more detail. I think it was a very kind gift on his part, and in fact I still have that microscope, and it has a place of honour in my office. It reminds me both of my long-dead uncle, but also of my love for the natural sciences, which all began instrumentally through that microscope. But I was also entranced by the night sky. And on cold winter evenings in Ireland, I was often, just fascinated by the solemn stillness of the night sky, by the stars against their black velvet background. And I often experienced a thrill of wonder at their silent beauty. So I made myself a little telescope, which allowed me to look at the night sky in more detail and depth, and actually helped me to appreciate its immensity and its strange beauty. And I often had the sense of standing on the threshold of something that was mysterious, what I now call a liminal experience. It was as if something beyond seemed to beckon to me to go further and discover it. And maybe that was why I decided I would be a scientist. And I set my heart on understanding and appreciating this strange and wonderful universe more profoundly. So at the age of 13, I began to concentrate on studying mathematics and natural sciences. And I saw these as tools that were necessary to understand our strange and wonderful universe in greater depth. Science was the gateway to this journey of discovery. And as I said, I saw my future as being a research scientist. So I began by loving science. It was all about appreciating the beauty of nature and experiencing the strange sense of yearning for something that seemed to lie beyond nature. But I gradually became a rather dogmatic teenage atheist, and I now saw science as a useful weapon against religious belief. I think this happened around when I was 16. I was drawn to atheism because of the apparent certainty of its convictions. And again, certainty mattered to me. I wanted to know things with absolute clarity and conviction. Belief in God demanded faith, but belief in atheism was just, obviously right. There was no scientific evidence for the existence of God, and therefore it was obvious there was no God. I could be certain about that. And although I tend to think of my move to atheism as arising purely from intellectual factors, I think there was a sociological dimension. This was the way that things seemed to be going, and I wanted to be on the cutting edge of things. I think it was very trendy at the time to be an atheist. But I also found that the natural sciences met this craving on my part for certainty. Why? Well, because at that stage I believed that science answered life's big questions with certainty. In other words, it proved its beliefs, and I wanted to inhabit a universe in which everything was clear and unambiguous. I think that's one of the reasons I was attracted to mathematics and the natural sciences, because of their absolute commitment to proving what was right. And atheism just seemed to me to be the natural viewpoint of a scientist. It was something that was right, that conformed with the evidence, unlike religion, which seemed to me to be running away from reality. Now, of course, there are different kinds of atheism. Some people just don't believe in God, having never given the matter very much thought. I suppose in some sense those people are atheists. I wasn't that kind of atheist. I was a committed atheist, someone who actively believed that there is no God, and therefore anyone who thought otherwise was sad or mad, or possibly both of those. It just seemed to me the only serious intellectual option for a scientist, and I regarded those who failed to see this as being irrational and deluded. So what, you might wonder, led me to this rather dogmatic view? Well, I think initially I just regarded religion as unintelligible but harmless. But in my later teens, I began to think of it as dangerous and delusional. And I think there were three main factors that moved me in this direction. First of all, I rather uncritically accepted what is widely known as the warfare narrative. This is the view that science and religion are perennially and necessarily at war with each other. They don't exist side by side, they are enemies. Now, back in the 1960s, this warfare narrative was culturally dominant, although I have to say that recent scholarship has generally discredited this. But back in the 1960s, everyone seemed to think this was right. It was part, if you like, of a cultural groupthink. And this led me to draw the conclusion that since I loved science, I should hate its enemies. And of course, religion was perhaps the greatest of those enemies of science. But there was something else as well. In the second place, there were growing political and religious tensions in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s. And these eventually led to the outbreak of what the Irish somewhat euphemistically call the Troubles. And although I think we would now say that religion was involved in these tensions, I think it's now generally agreed that the real issue lay somewhere else with the politics of identity. However, back then, I chose to believe that religion was the real problem. Why? Well, it fitted into my increasingly aggressive atheist worldview. If there was no religion, I told myself, there'd be no religious violence. Simple. So why not just get rid of religion and the world would be a better place? But thirdly, as a result of the social tensions in Northern Ireland, I became involved with student Marxist groups at Queen's University Belfast. Now, back in the late 1960s, Marxism was immensely fashionable in progressive student circles. And I had many Marxist friends at Queen's University Belfast who helped me to see that Marxism offered me a coherent atheist worldview. It was a big picture of reality which made sense of the world and also of my life. And I found myself drawn to Marxism. It seemed to be a coherent and comprehensive way of making sense of things. And of course, it was scientific. It was evidence-based. It helped me to see that our physical and social worlds were not a jumble of disconnected facts. When you looked at them through a Marxist lens, history and experience seemed to form a pattern. If you like, there was a big picture of reality which could only be seen once you used the right lens to bring it into focus. Namely, of course, a Marxist lens. And when you used that lens, what once looked like a blur or a fuzzy collection of observations could now be seen as interconnected, part of a bigger picture. So as a strident, free-thinking student, it seemed to me that I had discovered the philosopher's stone, the key to thinking about our world, which made everything clear. And I was quite clear nobody forced this upon me. I was a free thinker who had discovered these things for myself. Although, looking back, I can now see, I think, that really I unwittingly fell victim to the force of social pressures and cultural prejudices. This, I was told, was the future. So I suppose I felt I ought to align myself with what the future would believe. And actually, isn't that really what progressive people do? They simply try to stay ahead of the curve wherever it's going. But listen, I wasn't on my own in thinking like this back in the late 1960s. Let me tell you more about those turbulent and fascinating times. Looking back, I can see the late 1960s were really interesting. We all felt we were standing on the brink of a new age, and many young people in Western Europe and America, and of course also in Ireland, believed they were standing on the threshold of a new golden age. Now, sure, some of my student friends wanted to become laid-back hippies, but most were drawn to Marxism. Why? Well, I think because this philosophy seemed to many young people, and certainly to me, to diagnose society's problems on the one hand, and to offer a credible solution to them on the other. It marked a break with the past. And so many of us just felt that we were on the threshold of a brave new world, a new social, political, intellectual order, and it was really an exciting time to be alive. Sure, it all ended in disillusionment, but we didn't know that back then. So I became an enthusiastic, and I have to say rather uncritical advocate of a Marxist worldview. And one of the things that really impressed me about Marxism was it offered me a coherent and interconnected vision of human history and culture. It was almost actually like a religion without the intellectual inconvenience of believing in a non-existent God. And I was drawn to this big picture. It expanded my mind. It enabled me to take more things in and see how they were fundamentally interconnected. And I gained an appetite for big pictures of our world. Now, atheism, of course, was central to Marxism. In fact, my Marxist friends made a link between atheism and the natural sciences. And that was really important to me, brought together atheism and science. And they assured me that Friedrich Engels, who I hadn't read yet, had brought together and held together science and atheism in his scientific Marxist outlook. So if Engels was right, science and atheism were not disconnected. They were integral parts of the Marxist big picture of reality. I think you can see why I felt scientific atheism was the philosophy of the future. It was right for me. It was right for everyone. So I found myself believing I had found an intellectual safe haven. It was immune from criticism and awkward demands for confirming evidence. It just seemed obviously right. And at that time, Marxism seemed to me to be unassailable. It gave me these answers to life's big questions, which were based on evidence and helped me to make sense of our world and history. This was now something I could be certain about, and which allowed me to dismiss religion as a simple, outdated delusion, a relic of a bygone, credulous age. And it seemed to me, as it seemed to so many at the time, that atheism was intellectually invulnerable, an unsinkable ship of reason. Let me expand on that, because back in the 1960s, Belfast was still well known as a centre for shipbuilding. But perhaps the most famous ship ever to be constructed in Belfast was the Titanic, which was launched in May 1911. And as I look back on my thinking in the 1960s, I can see that my aversion to uncertainty and my mistaken belief that the natural sciences offered certainty in relation to life's big questions led me to think of atheism as a kind of intellectual Titanic, something unsinkable. In embracing atheism, I believed that I had boarded an invulnerable, an unsinkable ship which I could use to travel through life. And then, to my shock and my surprise, I discovered I was shipwrecked and I needed to find a place of safety. So I'll talk more about this perhaps surprising development in the next two presentations, because I'm going to tell you more about how I discovered and explored the island of faith. I once thought atheism was the only serious option for a thinking person who loved science. Yet I began to realize that atheism was actually vulnerable, not least because of its spurious certainties, its lack of confirming evidence, and its intellectual overreach. Now, I'll talk more about this in the next two presentations. But for the moment, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.